Welcome, everyone. My name is Bob Lawrence. I direct the Center for Livable Future, and I am really delighted that you're all here for the 11th Edward and Nancy Dodge lecture. We've had a distinguished group of people come over the years, and today we are adding another wonderful jewel to that crown of the Dodge lectureships. Ed Dodge is with us today. Ed got his Master's of Public Health here at the school in 1967 before going off to work in Ethiopia. And back in 1996, when the Center for a Livable Future was established, and our colleagues in the communications office generously put a little note in the school bulletin, Ed was the first alumnus to say, "I like this idea." And he and his late wife, Nancy, made a generous contribution that has endowed this lectureship. And we thank you again, Ed, for that, and also thank you for being here today. I'm going to first introduce Brother Dave Andrews, and then Brother Dave is going to introduce our speaker, Olivier De Schutter. The entire session today is being recorded and also webcast, and you'll have opportunities to ask questions live and via Twitter feeds in the Q&A part. So we hope you'll all participate in that way. Brother Dave trained as a sociologist and a lawyer. He's a member of the Congregation of Holy Cross. He's been working for social justice and healthier food systems for 35 years. Several of us from the Center for a Livable Future went up to the University of New Hampshire about 8 years ago, I think it was, to a conference on food systems and food equity. And Brother Dave was the keynote speaker and gave a talk on eating as a moral act. And little did he know at the time that he was in the crosshairs of our site. And subsequently, we persuaded Brother Dave to serve on the Pew Commission on industrial food animal production. He has this morning been in the studio recording a new lecture for the online food systems course that's offered every year in the second term. And after 13 years of distinguished service as director of the National Catholic Rural Life Conference in Des Moines, Iowa, Brother Dave joined Food and Water Watch, an advocacy organization in DC with whom we work very closely. So Brother Dave, welcome back to the family again, and thank you for all you do for the world, and especially what you do for us here in the Center for a Livable Future.
Thank you very much, Bob. And thank you to the Center for Livable Futures for giving me a place to come from time to time. And indeed, I do work for Food and Water Watch, a place that has become really essential to my being as a place of strong and rigorous advocacy, and a place where the lives of the earth and of the poor of the earth are taken seriously. In 2008, I served as a senior advisor to the President of the General Assembly of the United Nations, Miguel de Schutter. And the first thing that he said to me was, "I have been speaking to Olivier De Schutter, the Special Rapporteur on the right to food, and I have promised him that I will have a General Assembly meeting, what's called a thematic dialogue, for a day, and your job is to organize that day." So in organizing it, was finally held in 2009, but in organizing it, I, of course, had to communicate frequently with the special rapporteur, Olivier De Schutter. And so in doing so, got to know him and got to know more about his work. The role of special rapporteur for the United Nations is not a role that's well known in the United States. And it's a term that we're not familiar with. But the task of the special rapporteur, and there are a number of them for the United Nations, is to really take seriously the agenda, in this case, the right to food, to look at countries and their behavior relative to the exercise of their public on the right to food, and to make known the responsibilities of governments to fulfill those obligations under international law. So here on this stage today, you will have access to a role that's vital to the globe relative to keeping the needs of people and the needs of Earth in the forefront of the public sense of responsibility. And I think that's the key insight that I would have you take away, is that Olivier De Schutter, as his predecessors, take this role seriously, exercise the responsibility seriously, and help us all kind of get a perspective that otherwise would be seriously lacking in public discourse and in public responsibility. The right of billions of inhabitants of this earth to not only be free from hunger, but also to have recognized by governments at really every level the right that they have under international law to be free from hunger, to be free from starvation, and to be acknowledged as having the dignity that they indeed have. So I'm happy to welcome and to visit again with my friend and colleague, Olivier De Schutter, and invite him to the stage. Please welcome him.
Thank you very much, Bob and Dave, for these introductions. And I have to first thank, of course, the Bloomberg School of Public Health for the invitation, and Ed Dodge for his generosity and for the opportunity he provides to me to interact with this community. I've been asked to speak about food systems and their relationship to famines and human rights. And as you know, we are today in a situation which is particularly worrisome. 7 billion people on Earth, 1 billion people approximately who are hungry, about 178 million children below 5 years of age who are stunted, with fewer opportunities for mental and physical development, and every year between 3 and 3.5 million children die directly or indirectly from the causes of undernutrition. That is the situation we are facing. And what I'd like to propose is a way of understanding what the problem is, the reasons why we are led to this situation, in order to move from this diagnosis to identifying perhaps some solutions. Now, there is one classical way to understand hunger, which is the one that guides most policymakers when they are reasoning on this issue. And this is by looking at these figures. The number of undernourished people in the world, which has been diminishing slightly from 875 million in 1970 to below the mark of 800 million in 1995, and then has gone up again, has met a significant increase in 2008, 2009 as a result of higher food prices on a global level, and then this figure has slightly gone down since the prices have receded in 2009. Now, if we were to continue this graph, we would have a move upwards as a result of the higher prices over the past 12 months. And then they look at this other graph, which is perhaps more reassuring, showing the proportion of hungry people in the world. We were at a very high percentage in the early 1970s. This percentage gradually declined, and in 1990, 20% of the world's population was hungry. And the commitment made with the Millennium Development Goals was to divide by 2 this proportion of undernourished people in comparison to the levels of 1990. So to achieve by 2015 an objective that was set at 10% of the global population that were to be hungry. And we are far from achieving this objective. We are now at about 16%. And then they look at this third representation of hunger, which is the evolution of prices. And they are reassured that the prices have been structurally declining, although they've increased with the oil crisis in 1973, and although there have been recent increases of the food prices on international markets over the past 3 or 4 years. Now, basically what I'd like to say is these ways of looking at hunger are very unhelpful. They don't teach us anything about hunger. In fact, they are misleading and they lead to the wrong solutions. And they're misleading for a number of reasons. First, because they focus on aggregates. And they therefore lead policymakers to see hunger as a mismatch between supply and demand. People are hungry, well, let's produce more, and the problem will be addressed. It leads to solutions that seek to boost production, to reduce prices, pitting the urban poor consumers against the interests of the farmers who produce the food on which we all depend. The problem, in my view, is not high prices that are too high or prices that are too low. It's the gap between the farm gate prices received by the producers and the prices paid at the end of the chain by the consumers. And yes, the prices are too high for poor consumers, but yes, they are too low for many small farmers who cannot make a decent living from their farming. And most important, these graphs, which I've shown, do not distinguish between different hungers. There is no hunger. Hunger does not exist in the singular. It exists only in the plural. The hunger of the small farmer is not the same as the hunger of the urban poor. The hunger of the agricultural worker is not the same as those of indigenous peoples who lose their livelihoods as a result of their forests being fenced. And we have to really move towards a much more complex understanding of hunger that basically would propose another simplification, but which is, I believe, less misleading than the earlier ones. And this is an understanding of hunger that takes as departure point the situation of those who are hungry. And we could have a large number of hungers that we could distinguish and discuss. I will focus on essentially 4 categories to explain what hunger is about and basically introduce to what the right to food can propose to address this. First, it is quite remarkable that probably 50% of the 1 billion people hungry today are small-scale farmers living in developing countries, right? Altogether, we have some 500 million households in the world who depend on small-scale farming for a living. About 2 billion individuals. And a large number of them are unable to achieve a decent living from farming. What is the situation of these people? These people cultivate very small plots of land, often 1 or 2 hectares of land, and they produce sometimes enough for themselves for a few months per year, but they do not produce enough to sell food on the markets and have sufficient incomes to overcome the gap between the bridge between the season during which they can feed themselves with what they've produced and the lean season, when the reserves have been exhausted and when they have to buy the food on the market with the cash that they've received from selling the few surpluses that they had. In many cases, these people sell their crops at very low prices because they sell during the harvest season, during which the prices are low, and they have to buy their food 4 or 5 months later, before the next harvest, during the lean season, at sometimes 2x, 3x the price at which they sold their food in the first place. And the reason for this is because they have no storage facilities, because they cannot negotiate fair prices with the buyer, the middleman who buys the crops to sell them in the cities, and they have very poor information about prices, and they're not well organized in order to strengthen their bargaining position. That is the situation of these small farmers. And so, quite paradoxically, they form a significant group amongst the billion people who are hungry today. We have a second group, which is composed of landless agricultural workers, people who, in some cases, have mortgaged their land and have fallen in debt, have been obliged to sell their land, and depend on the workforce that they sell on large-scale plantations. Today, it's estimated that we have globally some 450 million workers active in the agricultural sector, and a significant proportion of them, estimated at perhaps 200 million, have wages that are simply too low for them to eat in dignity and to live decently. In many cases, these are workers who are not able to form unions. They are highly dependent on their employer, who provides them wages, but also houses, in the best cases, education and access to food in the store in the large plantations. And in many cases, these workers are indebted from generation to generation. In some cases, they are seasonal workers, and it's not unusual in many rural communities in developing countries for 1 or 2 members of the family to work on large farms for 3, 4, 6 months per year because the small family farm is unable to provide for sufficient incomes for the whole family. So there are many, of course, movements between the two first groups, and these are not categories that are clearly distinguished from one another. In these large plantations, we have lots of child labor. It's estimated that about 132 million boys and girls between ages 5 and 14 are employed in the plantation sector on a global scale. This represents 70% of child labor globally. We have a third category, which is composed of small herders, pastoralists, small artisanal fishers, indigenous peoples who depend on the forests for hunting, for fishing, for gathering fruit. And these categories depend very much on natural resources for their livelihoods. So these are on the front line of climate change, very deeply affected today by the destruction of natural resources on which they depend. And then finally, we have a fourth category, which is that of the urban poor. It's rapidly growing. Today, about 45% of the population in developing countries is in the cities. And Many of them have migrated from the rural areas because farming was not sufficiently viable, and they then populate these slums around the large cities. We have today an estimated 1.2 billion people living in the slums in developing countries. There will be some 2 billion by 2030. So it's very rapidly growing, imposing a very heavy toll on the public services in these cities. Now, these are different groups. They call for different policies. The needs of these groups will not be met simply by increasing the levels of production, if it leads to impoverish further these groups and to marginalize them further from the food systems. So all these groups have specific needs and call for distinct policies. At the same time, they have been victims of one same process of development. We have produced hunger. And we've produced hunger over the years by depriving peasants from their ability to produce, by not supporting them in their ability to produce from the small plot of land that they cultivate. We have allowed poverty and inequality to progress in rural areas. As a result, many of them have been forced to become wage workers on large plantations where they are exploited. Many others have migrated to the cities. Some subsist on subsistence farming, but hardly so. And we have created this mass of urban poor whom we only can help today by dumping cheap products on the urban markets, thereby making it even more difficult for small farmers living 30 kilometers away to achieve a decent living from their work as food producers. That is, in a nutshell, what happened. And we don't understand hunger without looking at this figure and looking at this chain of causes. And this is a process that was politically driven. These are choices made by decision makers. The right to food is about this, right? It's about taking as departure point the situation of those who are hungry, climbing up the chain of causes to identify at some moment one decision that was made that was a political decision for which people must be held accountable. That is what the right to food is. It's not about finding the technical means to improve yields. Let me detail a little bit this démarche, which I'm trying to introduce to by looking at the genealogy of hunger. Where does it come from? What have been these choices? What has been the short history of hunger that explains that today, in a world of plenty, we have 1 billion people who are hungry? Well, let me distinguish perhaps two big periods which correspond to two distinct sets of policies. One first period is beginning with the independencies in the developing world, what was then called the Third World, until the 1980s. So this period, roughly 2 decennia, during which governments were concerned with agriculture, but in ways that never quite supported the rural poor. Let me explain. We had some governments who sought to develop agriculture with a very specific purpose: to support the urban populations, the urban elites on which governments depended for their political stability. And so these governments basically supported the food producers in order to have them produce at low prices the crops that could be sold at low prices on the urban markets. Strategic crops were to be produced by these small producers. They were supported by the government to a certain extent, but in many cases, the support they received did not compensate for the costs that they incurred, and it was not unusual to see that they were paid for their crops prices lower than the production costs themselves. And that is what was famously referred to as the urban bias, that basically led to a net transfer of wealth from the rural populations to the urban populations. That was the case in many African countries, particularly in the 1960s and 70s. linked to this idea that development depended on fast industrialization and that therefore the urban populations should be supported, even though this might be at the expense of the rural areas. This is also a period during which these countries, despite their professed attempt to industrialize themselves, in fact remain producers of raw commodities for export markets, and I shall return to this point in a second. And then this was also a period during which in some regions of the world we had a fear that if production were not significantly increased in the short term, people would grow hungry as a result of very rapid demographic growth that food production was unable to meet. And that was the fear motivating governments, particularly in the 1960s. This led to a technological revolution in agriculture, which is referred to as the Green Revolution, although that label was appended to this revolution in 1968, some years after it was launched on a very large scale. What is the Green Revolution? The Green Revolution is something that, as many of you will know, began as an experiment in Mexico in 1943, when the Rockefeller Foundation funded the International Center for the Improvement of Wheat and Maize, and CIMIT being the Mexican or the Spanish acronym for this center, and supported the work of some US-based scientists, such as Norman Borlaug, the most famous amongst them, to improve the maize and later the wheat that was cultivated in order to boost the yields. And what these scientists did, inter alia, was to develop new varieties of wheat, maize, and later rice and potato that were fast growing. These were, for example, half dwarf varieties of wheat and maize that could photosynthesize the energy from the sun faster and produce better yields per hectare. And this was combined in the regions that adopted these new varieties with large-scale irrigation, with mechanization, with the use of external inputs, fertilizers and pesticides on a very large scale, that led to significant increases in yields. It began in Central Latin America, but in 1966, 1967, it migrated to South Asia, beginning with India, the Philippines, and Pakistan, who imported seeds from CIMIT, from Mexico, and who launched the Green Revolution then in South Asia. Now, the results of the Green Revolution were quite paradoxical, because on the one hand, the Green Revolution was a success in that the yields increased very significantly. In fact, in a period of 5 or 6 years, between 1966 and 1971, India and Pakistan practically doubled their production of wheat as a result of these new technologies being imported and developed on a large scale in these countries. And as you can see on this graph, the regions which developed or adopted the Green Revolution approaches indeed increased their production very significantly in comparison to Sub-Saharan Africa, where this Green Revolution never really gained ground. And that, one might say, is the successful part of the Green Revolution. The increases in total production of grains on the global level, despite the fact that the areas that were harvested remained stable and even in some regions decreased as a result of urbanization and industrialization making progress. So, yes, that was a success in this respect. In South Asia, 309 million tons of cereals were produced in 1961. In 2000, the amount was 962 million tons, almost, more than tripling, actually, the volumes produced. At the same time, the Green Revolution created a number of problems. And it is quite telling that at the same time that we increase the food availability per person, so even taking into account demographic growth, the number of hungry people continue to increase. In South Asia and Latin America, during the period 1970-1990, the food availability per capita increased by 8% during these 20 years. At the same time, in Latin America, the number of hungry people increased by 17%. And in South Asia, the number of hungry people increased by 9%. So we produced more per person, more food available per person, and at the same time, poverty, inequality increased, and we found out that the number of hungry people continued to rise. Why is that? Well, there are two reasons essentially for this. One is that these increases in volumes, and you have here the orange lines for rice, maize, and wheat, the global production of rice, maize, and wheat between 1961 and 2000, at the same time that the volumes increased, the prices decreased, right? That makes perfect sense. And as a result of the prices decreasing, farming became non-viable for small producers who were less competitive and unable to continue to farm with such low prices being paid to them. So that was the first problem. Those who survived were the most competitive, the largest, those who could support this shock of lower prices despite the cost of production. And the second reason is that this capitalized type of farming that required farmers to buy inputs, to borrow in order to buy inputs, that required for them that they mechanize themselves, that they achieve economies of scale, that they accept to be indebted in order to be able to produce, that was not suitable for a large number of small farmers who were just not equipped to shift to this new capitalized type of farming. Right? For example, female-headed households who could not obtain access to credit from moneylenders, or those whose lands were too small for them to achieve economies of scale, or those simply who had no title on their land so that they could not borrow money and invest in this type of production. So the Green Revolution had these problematic social impacts. And then it had, of course, problematic environmental impacts. And again, many of you are familiar with this. The first environmentalist was actually a US citizen, Rachel Carson, who published The Silent Spring, I believe it was 1962, in which the year in which this book was published, denouncing for the first time the impacts of industrial agriculture on the ecosystems. Right? The loss of crop genetic diversity. Today in the world, about 150 species are being cultivated out of the tens of thousands that we could cultivate for food needs. And in fact, the most of the efforts have been put into 12 plant species, amongst which wheat, rice, maize, and potato take the lion's share in the research that is done. So we have a narrowed down basis from which we produce food. Right? And this is largely the result of the fact that we've been developing these new varieties of seeds and plants in order to respond to this need to increase the yields by these genetic improvements. We've accelerated soil erosion and degradation of soils because of monocultures developing and because of the use of chemical fertilizers. We've polluted groundwaters by the excessive use of fertilizers and pesticides. We've increased pollution from the mechanization of the farm and the use of chemical fertilizers, a major source of nitrous oxide in the atmosphere, which, as you know, is one of the most potent greenhouse gases that we emit. So the Green Revolution was also about this. right? The development of industrial agriculture in developing countries, more or less mimicking the process that has been followed between 1920 and 1960 in European countries and in North America. And then we have a third aspect, which is sometimes underestimated, which is the aspect of nutrition. And since we are here in the School of Public Health, even more than for the other topics, I have to confess my embarrassment of speaking before such a knowledgeable audience about things that you are all aware of. What we know is that at the same time that we increased the number of calories produced per person, we actually shifted diets towards more carbohydrates, but sometimes foods that are less rich in micronutrients. Right? So we have now, apart from the 1 billion people who are hungry, underfed, we have 2 billion people who suffer from malnutrition, right? A lack of essential micronutrients such as vitamin A, iron, zinc, folic acids, for example, which are essential to mental and physical development. And in fact, it's estimated that about 60% of the roughly 10 million children that every year die before the age of 5 die because of diseases that are linked to insufficiently diverse diets that lack these essential micronutrients. And one organization such as Biodiversity International, headed by Émile Frison, is working on precisely this topic and asking whether we should not study further the links between agro-biodiversity on the farm, the cultivation of a wide range of species on the one hand, and nutrition on the other hand. Simplifying farming, moving towards monocultures and the production of staple crops may be detrimental for public health as a result of these types of agriculture increasing or leading to diets that are insufficiently diverse. Let me turn briefly to the second period, the 1980s. The rise of a new economic orthodoxy referred to as neoliberalism, which actually is a period inaugurated by a series of structural adjustment programs imposed on developing countries. The first one was 1979 with Senegal, which led the state to retreat from agriculture and to basically allow the prices to link supply to demand without interference from the state, without the state coming at the rescue of small producers, without the state providing the farmers with subsidies or with certain types of support, for example, in the form of extension services. Right? That is what structural investment programs are about. Now, one key part of these structural adjustment programs, apart from the retreat of the state from agriculture, which was very difficult to cope with for many small farmers who depended on state support for their livelihoods, a key part was trade liberalization. And indeed, these countries in the developing world were encouraged to open up themselves to trade, to invest in the production of export commodities that could allow them to have access to foreign currencies, and to focus their efforts, therefore, on the production of a small range of raw commodities for the global markets, right? Cocoa, coffee, tea, tobacco, or sometimes soy and some crops of that nature, cash crops for export. The premise of the trade liberalization is a sound one. It is that by allowing each country to specialize in whatever type of production it is best at, efficiency gains will be achieved, and the overall benefits for the consumer will be visible in the form of lower prices and better production, increased levels of production. But in fact, as applied to agriculture, this dogma of free trade has had extremely problematic consequences. And I don't have time to go through these consequences in any detail, but I would like to emphasize one aspect of this, which is this illusion that farmers, producers, can easily adapt to price signals, because they cannot. It's simply not possible for particularly small farmers without support from the state to shift from one crop to another simply because the market gives a signal that there is a higher demand for this other crop than the one they have been traditionally cultivating. What you cultivate depends on the soil, on the weather, on the traditions, on your know-how. It depends on which seeds you have access to. It depends on which markets you have access to. It depends on investments that you can make and that take time to make before you can switch from one crop to another. So in fact, what has happened is that as the prices have been evolving, farmers have found that they were producing even more of the stuff that was not paying well because they needed to make up for the loss of revenue linked to low prices. So they produced even more coffee, for example, when the prices of coffee went down, leading to surplus production, accelerating the trend downwards. And when the prices went up, they very often were not in a position to seize the opportunities that this was meant to signify for them. Let me take just one example which is familiar to you, which is, of course, the entry into force of NAFTA on the 1st of January 1994. Many small farmers in Mexico were quite fearful that NAFTA would mean that they would be competing against the US Treasury, right? The very heavily subsidized farmers of the Midwest who would be exporting corn on the local Mexican markets. But they were told not to worry, because even though, yes, Mexico in time would open up its markets to the US corn, the Mexican farmers could switch to the production of fruits and vegetables. Right? That is, these are high-value crops, cash crops that the US and Canadian markets will buy from the Mexican farmers. So all they needed to do was to shift to those. And, they have a comparative advantage in fruit and vegetable. They have a winter growing season. They have low wages, and these are labor-intensive crops. So they were told, in fact, it's by remaining poor that you will maintain your competitive advantage. And they were promised that this switch would be easy to achieve. In fact, it was not. It was not, because apart from some farmers located in the north, they had no access to the markets, to the supply chains. They had no access to irrigation services, which of course is essential to produce fruits and vegetables. And the soils were simply not adapted. The steepiness of the soil in particular was not adapted to the production of fruits and vegetables. And so the result, as you know, is that over 10 years, between 1994 and 2004, some 2 million small campesinos from the Mexican countryside who cultivated maize for generations had to leave and either migrated to the US or to Mexico City. So that is one of the reasons why free trade has not functioned for agriculture, but there are other reasons of concern. Consider first that the countries that specialized in export crops had to compensate for this specialization by increasing their imports of food. And in fact, in many low-income countries, the degree of dependency on imports to meet the local consumption needs increased significantly during the 1980s and 1990s. The result, when prices go up on international markets, these countries are very severely impacted. This is a map drawn up by the World Bank in April 2008, as the prices, remember, were spiraling out of control then. And the bank found, unsurprisingly, that the countries who were the net food importers were the most severely impacted. Which countries? Well, these poor countries who had been relatively self-sufficient in food until the late 1970s and had switched to export crops only to discover that they had become extremely vulnerable as a result. This is why Adam Smith, in his Wealth of Nations, said free trade is excellent, but not for food. That's too dangerous. It's too strategic. It puts a country in a very vulnerable position if it does not produce enough for itself. And indeed, if we look at the food bills for the least developed countries, right, the poorest countries on earth, and this is the gray line, which is the one up the scale here, we see that the food bills, what they pay for the imports of food between 1990 and 2008 has been multiplied by 5 or 6. And so when the prices go up, it's multiplied even more, right? This dependency has increased. Now, since I'm in a School of Public Health, I would like to say a few more words about the nutrition crisis. In fact, what I'm trying to say here is that we have no food crisis, but we have two crises. A poverty crisis, which is the result of the fact that we have food systems that have not been sufficiently supportive of the incomes of the rural populations and of small farmers in particular. We have an environmental crisis, which I've alluded to, and then we have a nutrition crisis, which I also have alluded to. But let me say a few more words about the nutrition crisis, because this is actually one key topic for the future. And it is one topic on which in the next few months I intend to work further. Countries today face what I'd like to call a triple burden. We have undernutrition, for sure. We still have an incredibly high number of people who are not eating enough, who do not have the 2,500 kilocalories per day that you need as an adult to lead a healthy, productive life. Undernutrition. But we also have a large number of people who have the sufficient calorie intake, but do not have the adequate intake of essential micronutrients. About 2 billion people, as I said, lacking these essential micronutrients. So they're not starving, but they are not well nourished. And then we have, of course, and that's why it's a triple burden, people who are overfed, who have far too many calories, and have shifted to regimes which are rich in energy but made of not nutritious foods, and are victims, therefore, of a series of non-communicable diseases which are linked to unhealthy diets, right? Cardiovascular diseases, type 2 diabetes, or certain types of cancers, certain types of cancers that are linked to the diets that are consumed. Of course, this is a major public health problem in the United States. The graph here is one that was produced following the 2003-2004 National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey that concluded that 17% of children and adolescents in the US between ages 2 and 19, 70% are overweight, right? Have a bodily mass index that is above 25. And you have here a graph that decomposes this 17% across different ages. The evolution has been spectacular. The same data are shown in this map here that show how we are moving, the direction in which we are moving, although this will not be surprising to many of you. In 2004, it was estimated that 58 million Americans were overweight, 40 million obese, 3 million are suffering from morbid obesity, the most severe form of obesity. 8 out of 10 adults above the age of 25 are overweight in the US, which is topping the league with Mexico in this respect. And this has a huge impact on public health, right? 76% of type 2 diabetes, for example, are the result of obesity developing. 70% of cardiovascular diseases can be traced back to obesity. 42% of breast and colon cancers should be traced back to obesity. And of course, the list is a longer one. And one key concern here for states, or at least that's a concern they should have, is the impact this is having on the budgets of public health. For example, we know that the costs of type 2 diabetes in the US is about $98 billion because of the huge epidemics that this represents. And you have the costs for the other diet-related diseases here. Now, this is not a problem that is specific to the US, although the US is slightly in advance of other countries in this respect. In fact, it's something we see in all the OECD countries, right? England, Australia, Spain, Canada, on this graph are moving in the very same direction. Today, we have 1 billion people worldwide who are overweight, 300 million who are obese, and overweight and obesity are increasing very rapidly in transition economies. I was in Mexico in June, I was in Brazil earlier, I was in China in December last year, and I see that all the data point to these problems emerging, right? They face a double or a triple burden in these fast-growing economies. This is very significant, right? It's estimated that in 2030, some 5.1 million people will die before the age of 60 in developing countries as a result of obesity or overweight. Today, there are about 3.8 million adults dying from overweight or obesity in developing countries. Now, nutrition transition in fast-growing emerging economies is one part of this, right? Nutrition transition means that at one point in time, more processed foods become available to these populations that shift away from their traditional diets. It means that they are increasingly influenced by marketing practices, targeting particularly children for energy-rich foods. It means that they change lifestyles very rapidly, urbanizing, leading more sedentary lifestyles, and nevertheless still consuming high numbers of calories, leading to these problems of overweight and obesity. And I mean, for example, in Mexico, we have still 18% of the population that is considered to be food insecure. And we have 70% of the adults, 7 out of 10 adults in Mexico who are overweight or obese. And these people live, on average, 18 years of their lives sick, right? They have to be assisted, they have to take medicines because that is what overweight or obesity leads to. In China, we have about 11% of the population that is food insecure, and we have about 11% that is overweight or obese. In South Africa, 20% of the families are food insecure, and we have 56% of the women who are overweight or obese. And these are countries I visited recently to study this so-called double burden. Now, this graph is an illustration of what nutrition transition is about. At the same time that countries increase the average income per capita, right? The number of people who are overweight and obese increases at the same time that the number of undernourished people decreases. Now, you might think that the explanation for this is very simple. People have better incomes, they become richer, they therefore buy more food, and they move from a situation of undernutrition to a situation of overnutrition. Well, that is not exactly how things happen. Because the reality is that it is always the poor who pay the highest price. In poor countries, the poor are unable to feed themselves by consuming enough food, right? Food is simply unaffordable for them. So they are undernourished. In emerging economies, the poor are those who are buying the cheap calories, are victims of the marketing practices of the large corporations, and are not sufficiently well educated on their dietary needs, and so they shift to bad, unhealthy diets, in part because these diets are cheap enough for them to afford. So it's always the poor who are affected. And in fact, in our developed countries, as we know, the burden of overweight and obesity is particularly heavy on the lowest incomes within the population, right? The lowest quintile of the population. So it is the poor who are underfed and who today are malnourished, if we understand by this, who are not achieving a possibility to have sufficiently diverse, rich diets and suffer from these diseases. So we have three crises: poverty crisis, an ecological crisis, and finally this nutrition crisis. What can we do about this? I would suggest three directions to finish. First, I believe that it is urgent that we move towards more localized food systems. Let us work from the bottom up to rebuild links between local producers and local consumers. I was extraordinarily surprised in my work as special rapporteur traveling in developing countries to see that in many cases, the urban populations in these countries, they consume imported food that has traveled long distances, that is heavily processed often to survive these long travels. And they do not buy from the farmers who are located some 20, 30 kilometers from where they themselves are located. There's a huge disconnect between the local producers and the local consumers. There's no local market. So at the same time that the urban consumers are fed these unhealthy, heavily processed foods, the small farmers have no access. They have no people to sell to. There's no link between the two populations. And so they remain in poverty. They don't invest. They don't know whom to sell to. And they don't manage to improve their incomes. We have to reconnect them together by creating local markets. And this is the best way to reduce the gap between the farm gate prices received by the producers and the prices paid by the consumers. The shorter the chain is, the easiest it will be to reduce the gap between these two prices, right? So create farmers markets, support community-supported agriculture, provide transportation means to allow the small farmers in the countryside to have their crops sold on the cities so that they do not have to depend on the middlemen who capture a large amount of the end dollar paid by the consumer at the end of the chain. We have to rebuild these local food systems. In a city such as Belo Horizonte in Brazil, which had as a mayor Petros Ananias in the 1980s, that is what this mayor did. He later became the Minister for Social Development for Lula da Silva, right, in 2003 when Lula da Silva took over the Brazilian presidency. And Petros Ananias understood this. And in Belo Horizonte, he rebuilt a local food system that was being marginalized and that led the urban population of Belo Horizonte to depend on food imported from far abroad, while the small farmers had nobody to sell to. Right? And this was extremely successful in reducing malnutrition, but also in improving the quality of diets, because it meant that the urban populations had access to more diverse foods, fresher, more nutritious foods, particularly fruits and vegetables that were locally produced. I see the same in other cities today developing, not only in Brazil, but also, for example, in South Africa, in a city such as Durban. A second transition is towards agroecological food systems. Now, agroecology should not be mistaken for a return to traditional farming. Right? It is not a return or nostalgia of the past. although the mistake is often committed. For example, when the media discuss agroecology, that is a very commonly held misunderstanding. Agroecology is about complex farming system that replicate the very complexity of nature. Nature is all about relationships between plants, trees, animals that form systems that are mutually supportive, right? And that can function in harmony. But what have we done with our industrial types of agriculture? We have simplified the farming systems, negating this complexity inherent to nature. We've simplified things. Monocultures are about this, right? It's very simple. You produce one single crop, you use external inputs, you produce one output for the markets, the rest is waste. And it's very difficult to get rid of this waste. And we separate the plants produced in these large monocultures from the forests that are preserved in the forests that we may not touch, and animals which are, in feeding lots in what you call CAFOs in the US, industrial feeding lots in which the animals are not, produce waste excrements that are not recycled into the soil. Instead, contribute to landfills, which are extremely difficult to manage from the environmental point of view. So we've segmented the elements of nature. Well, agroecology is about reconstituting this complexity at field level. Instead of mimicking the industrial processes with external inputs, work on the farm, and one output, we try to mimic nature, replicate the natural complexity of nature. One example is the rice duck fish system, initially developed in Japan, now expanded to the Philippines, to Bangladesh, to parts of India. It's very simply explained. It's a good illustration of what agroecology is about. Rice farmers could fertilize the rice fields, the paddies, by using chemical fertilizers to increase the yields. One day, a farmer wanted not to be as dependent on chemical fertilizers as his neighbors and colleagues. And he found that by putting fish in the rice paddies and ducks in the rice paddies, he could achieve a number of things. First, the dejections of the fish and of the ducks could fertilize the rice paddies, so it grew faster. And note that he not only has rice growing faster, he economizes on the use of chemical fertilizers. In addition, the ducks, they eat up the insects that were destroying the crops sometimes, and so he could not be dependent on pesticides anymore. This is called biological control, right? And so putting fish and ducks in the paddies allowed him to produce more rice at a much lower cost, and in addition, now and then he could have some meat for the family. Right? This is one example. Another example, very typical, is agroforestry. Planting trees alongside food crops allows you to reduce erosion, allows you to have a soil that better captures the moisture of the rainfall, allows you to fertilize the soils if the roots of the trees capture the nitrogen from the atmosphere and inject this nitrogen into the soil, allowing you to use less or no chemical fertilizers. It depends on the type of trees, but acacias, quite common in Africa, perform this function in particular. And agroforestry can serve to rebuild the health of the soil in places where it has been heavily degraded. For example, this is a picture from the World Agroforestry Center based in Nairobi, but which has been working in Tanzania in particular. 350,000 hectares of land have been reclaimed from the desert, which you see on the left, right, by agroforestry programs in Tanzania. These western provinces of Tanzania are now green. They were desertifying themselves in the 1990s. A third example, perhaps, if I may, the push-pull strategy that my friend Hans Herren has been promoting in particular. Push-pull means something very simple. Instead of using heavy doses of insecticides, pesticides in order to protect your maize crops, you will interplant with the maize crops some plants that repel the insects. You push insects away. And alongside the fields, you plant other crops that will attract the insect, pulling the insect, and trapping the insect. These are plants which produce some sort of stickiness on their leaves so that the insects are captured. Right? This has been developed in Kenya, now expanding in other parts of East Africa, benefiting thousands of farmers who can not depend as much on pesticides and yet have their crops very well protected by this type of biological control. It is also beneficial because the napier grass that is intercropped with maize in this type of push-pull strategy is one that can feed the cattle. So it's also a useful way to produce feedstock. That is what agroecology is about, and I believe that we should urgently, radically move towards this type of food production, particularly in developing regions where industrial agriculture has not already gained ground and where these choices still have to be made. Let me say that these two shifts from food systems that are basically dependent on long distances and on food imports to more localized food systems, shift number one. And the shift from industrial agriculture to agroecological practices, shift number two, will not be easy to achieve. And because they will not be easy to achieve, we need to manage this transition, which poses problems of governance. Governments are focused on the short term, right? November 2012. They are not particularly interested in the long-term health of communities, of soils, of the planet. And they are not interested in anything else than in reassuring the public that they are doing things to increase the yields. So we need to build into the governance systems of our democracies systems that will oblige governments to act on the basis of the scientific evidence that now is uncontested. How to do this? Well, this is where the right to food comes in. Amartya Sen, the, of course, Nobel Prize in Economics 1998, is the major thinker on the right to food, despite not being a lawyer, or maybe thanks to not being a lawyer, I should say. Amartya Sen wrote the most important book on hunger that I myself have ever read, which is Poverty and Famines, 1981. Finding, as you all know, that famines had not their source necessarily in the lack of food availability, but could result from the fact that despite the harvests being very good, some groups of the population had too low incomes, were losing their revenues, losing their employment so that they were unable to feed themselves. So hunger was redefined as a problem of social justice, of lack of accountability, of a failure for government to develop redistributive social programs and to be sufficiently paying attention to the problems of the very poor. So Sen taught us to look at food, hunger, not just as a problem of supply and demand, but as a problem of accountability, social justice. And we have to use the right to food for this very reason, because it matters to hold governments accountable. And the right to food, of course, has made progress since 1981. It has been developed, as Bob Lawrence was reminding us earlier today, in the 1990s, particularly with the work of the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. And what we, coming from the right to food world, try to promote increasingly is the adoption of national strategies that governments should put in place to progressively realize the right to food. Action plans that define not just the objective to be achieved, what is desirable, which is fairly easy to formulate, but the various pathways by which this can be achieved, right? The set of measures that must be adopted. And these measures should be listed in a calendar. They should be assigned to different bodies of government. So the responsibilities must be allocated across branches of government, and these branches of government should be held accountable for the results that they've achieved. And we do this by establishing an independent monitoring of the fulfillment of this strategy. That is what a strategy for the realization of the right to food is about. It is a calendar of actions linked to accountability mechanisms. It's not about the end vision. It's not about the utopia at the end only. It's about the way to get there, right? So it bridges the gap between small reforms, minor measures that are often dismissed as too small to make any difference, to utopian views that are dismissed as utopian and as unrealistic. National strategies bridge the gap between reform and revolution, between the short term and the long term. And if complemented with independent monitoring systems, they can have an impact in the way governments go about realizing the right to food. And the importance is not, I emphasize, the ultimate vision, because we always have to learn while implementing these strategies. These strategies are important because they show how to begin. It's not, if you wish, about architecture. It's about music, where every note counts. Thank you.
Inspiring. We're going to now have a very brief conversation with Brother Dave. Why don't you sit in the center here, Olivia? And then we're going to have your questions and comments, and then we are going to have a reception with food right outside, healthy food. Locally sourced, and we hope all of you will be able to join us for that. But Brother Dave, why don't we start with you?
It strikes me, listening to you, Olivier, that there are public policies that get institutionalized. And so the Department of Agriculture, the Department of Justice, Department of Health, begin or find themselves in a particular direction and find it hard to change, so that the solutions of the past become the solutions of the present, despite sometimes the good intentions of people that are in the leadership offices. I remember speaking with Governor, now Secretary of Agriculture Vilsack, when he was a state senator. And at that time, he was a proponent of community-based solutions for the villages and towns that he represented. That we need to have the communities involved in development and not just seek expert answers to the conditions. And I wonder what happens when people join a political party or when they join or lead an institution. What happens to that initiative, to that sensibility, so that the focus, for example, on the cult of efficiency that gets institutionalized in agriculture, where a head of a grain company tells me 15, 20 years ago, the family farm was a nice way to live, but it's gone because the competition of the Anderson Grain Company in Toledo, Ohio is in Argentina or China, and the fewer hands we have on the land, the more efficient we'll be. And so the government comes up with a bigger is better public policy. And I'm trying to find out, how do we shift in the direction of agroecology? How do we shift in the direction of movement away from calories to nutrition. How do all these changes that come up in your presentation, does it take leadership, or how do we get away from the inertia of the past?
Thanks. Maybe two things. First, the question by Brother Dave does point to certainly one missing element in my presentation, amongst many others, which is the need to democratize the food systems. I'm very interested and actually studying for the moment the importance of food policy councils as developed in Canada, as emerging also in some parts of the US, in which local communities try to understand where their food is sourced from, what can be done to improve the system for the health of the food systems and for ensuring that all have access not just to food at an affordable price, but also to food that actually nourishes you. And I believe this is absolutely essential as a counterweight to the very powerful forces of the market. And then the second missing element, again, amongst many others in my presentation, which you point at, is the contrast between, or the unequal comparison between small family farming and the large industrial types of farming. And I believe that the term of productivity or efficiency is very ambiguous when applied to this discussion. Usually what we mean by productivity, what economists mean by productivity is labor productivity, right? How much do you produce by active laborer? If we use that benchmark, that standard, yes, the large-scale plantations that replace men by tractors, they are quite productive. And as a result, they are very competitive on the markets. They can dump cheap food at low prices on the markets. And the small family farms will be wiped out. This is now increasingly occurring in developing countries. It has occurred in our countries for many years. But there is another measure of productivity, which is how do you use the resources in the most efficient way? And in fact, all studies now converge to show that per surface of land cultivated, small farms are more efficient, more productive than the large plantations. So yes, they are relatively more labor intensive. They are therefore less competitive, but they are more efficient in their use of the land and water that we have at our disposal. And so we have to invest in this type of farming, allow the small farmers to be supported in the ability they have to make the best use of the natural resources at our disposal. And we need to reward them for the positive externalities that they deliver, the positive services that they render, for which they are not rewarded currently. They contribute to rural development. They contribute to slowing down the migration to the cities, which the cities today cannot cope with in many developing countries. They contribute to providing local communities with food that, because it's locally sourced, can be fresher, more nutritious than food that is imported from faraway places. And so of course, they take better care in many cases of the ecosystems. All this must be rewarded, and the prices we pay must reflect the real cost of the food that is produced in industrial settings and the real benefits of the food that is produced by other means than those that we have been used to.
Thank you. I'm conscious of the time, so I'm going to leave a few minutes for your questions. I just want to say that your three solutions really are very validating and inspiring, because we have within the Center for Livable Future, Ann Palmer has been a key person stimulating the development of the Baltimore Food Policy Council, and Ann serves on the National Board of Food Policy Councils. We have Mia, who has taken such good care of you, Mia Salucci and Brent Kim, Amanda Barron's, all critically important in developing a CSA that now is in its fourth year here at the school, working with the farm in Baltimore County, the One Straw Farm. We have a project about to start of agroecology with tilapia and aquaponics in a borrowed City of Baltimore greenhouse that David Love and some of his colleagues are developing. Ralph Laglisi, who picked you up at the train station, is heading up our Healthy Monday initiative, Meatless Monday, to reduce the amount of saturated fat in our diet. I'm leaving out lots of other people, but you're touching on things that make me feel maybe we're on the right track, which is really great. But the issue of accountability, the third one, that's where Food and Water Watch and where the advocacy role that we're playing with our policy folks, Ronnie Neff and Becca Klein, and others who are guiding our efforts to really hold accountable the policymakers at the state and federal level to be sure that the first two criteria can be met. So I didn't anticipate that, but that closing set of comments was wonderful for all of us. So thank you for that. Questions? Who, right over here.
I have two. You can choose which to answer. One question is, have you talked to foundations such as the Gates Foundation that I think are funding a different vision of green revolution and technical solutions about your ideas? And my other question has to do with our farm bill. Does our farm bill impact famine? And if so, what policies should we be trying to build into the farm bill as it comes up in the next year?
Well, although it would be very easy given the way you introduced your two questions, I don't want to avoid the second one, but it's one I can't really answer because I have some ideas about the Farm Bill, but have never studied it in any detail. So allow me, please, to skip that one. Although I look forward to studying this in detail, and I do hope that one day the US government will invite me to do a mission in the US, as I've requested since 9 months, so that I can, based on the evidence that I collect across the world on the way food systems develop, provide some non-subversive recommendations. The first question, I haven't spoken to the Gates Foundation because they haven't seized the opportunities I created for this to happen. On a couple of occasions, there were media wanting a debate between Bill Gates and myself, but for agenda reasons, this never could materialize. What I did do was have a long, ongoing dialogue with the Alliance for the Green Revolution in Africa, which of course they fund, and which is a major driver in agricultural development on the continent for the moment. And I mean, to simplify things for the sake of time, I would say that they are clearly well-intended, that it's a context in which there is a need for more support going to small farmers, but that the type of support they provide and the way they target the support will leave many people out and will create, for those who are supported, a dependency on certain technologies which in the long term they may come to regret. So I believe that there are many ways we can support farmers, right? By forming cooperatives, by allowing them to participate in decision making, by providing them with storage facilities, by developing local markets, by improving infrastructure, by informing them about prices, allowing them to climb up the value chain in marketing and processing what they produce in terms of crops, many ways. And I just began a very long list. But it will not do just to provide them with technologies without all the governance being improved and without these technologies being appropriate to their needs, right? But it's a very complex debate, which I haven't had yet with the Gates Foundation.
With regard to the 9 months and waiting request that Olivier has submitted to our government, that has risen to a high point on our advocacy calendar, as you might suspect. He can't say that, we can say that. In the back. Yes.
Hi. I just wanted to ask about the United Nations position on access to food and food security in people living in areas of conflict, such as in East Africa. I mean, in some of these areas of conflict, it's not a short-term conflict, it's about decades of conflict and, you know, the human rights to access food. How do you address that problem?
Well, I mean, I'm not a spokesperson for the UN, so I can't answer in that capacity for the system, if you wish. And there are many different agencies who would answer different ways your question. But obviously, it is extremely difficult to protect the right to food in these circumstances, both because when persons are displaced, they cannot continue to cultivate as sedentary agriculturalists. And secondly, because access to markets, linking the producers to the consumers, access of food aid even to populations in need, as we see now in parts of Somalia, is made impossible. There's no, I mean, what I'm saying, just a set of platitudes. I can't say much more, except that, in my view, it's a very serious violation, not just of the right to food, but also it's a crime against humanity, which should lead these people responsible for these situations to be tried before international courts. Once you knowingly deny access to food aid for populations in need, right? We today have 2.8 million people trapped in southern Somalia in the hands of these Shabab who cannot be reached by food aid. This is a crime against humanity, right? It's deliberately targeting civilians and using food as a weapon of war, and that's just completely unacceptable.
Do you know whether the ICC has initiated any charges on that basis?
No, it would be interesting to try, but it's not a low-hanging fruit exactly. Somalia would need to ratify the statute of the ICC, which it hasn't, in part because since 1991 they have no government. So there's no realistic prospect of this ever happening.
I see a number of hands, but is there a class coming in here? How many are willing to wait 5 more minutes for your locally sourced food? That looks like a plurality. Okay, let's take 2 more questions. Yes. Wait for the mic, please. Jamie's getting his aerobic conditioning ready.
Thanks so much for your talk, Dr. De Schutter. The paradigm of food production as it is now seems to necessitate highly concentrated, industrialized model capable of economies of scale. Is there a way, given that political considerations brought us to this point, that small farmers can transition into a more profitable model without unionization or organization, given that that also is a hot political issue? That in itself is a hotly contested issue with many governments.
Well, you see, the question of economies of scale is a bit tricky in this context. There are economies of scale in certain parts of the production process, right? Clearly, in the marketing, in the processing, there are economies of scale that can be achieved. But at the level of taking care of the crops on the field, no. And as I said, and this is true for the US as in all other countries, the smaller the farm, the higher the productivity per surface cultivated. The reason is very simple. When you have a small plot of land, right, in the US, small would mean 12, 15 hectares, right? You take great care of it. You use it in the best way possible. In other countries, a small plot of land would mean 1.5 hectares, perhaps. But the smaller the farm, the higher the productivity. So that's not where economies of scale are achieved. However, for the use, for example, of small machines, for bargaining a fair price for the crops, for negotiating with government certain types of support, economies of scale can be achieved by farmers joining their efforts and forming organizations in order to weigh as economic actors in the food chain and as political actors in the decision-making system. And that they very much need to do. I think what would be most viable in most developing countries where there is still a large, small-scale farming sector would be to support those small farmers, but at the same time to acknowledge that they need to be encouraged to form cooperatives, unions, organizations, for all the reasons I've indicated. And in fact, some of the models that work best are, some hundreds of farming families that together negotiate with a buyer to sell their crops, or negotiate with government the type of support that they need, and exchange information and knowledge.
Brother Dave, would you say a word about the practical farmers of Iowa and how they're approaching this economies of scale?
Practical farmers of Iowa are a group of large number of farmers that cooperate and collaborate together, that show each other on field studies on their farms how to utilize a better cropping method or better husbandry of livestock. So that in Iowa, the practical farmers of Iowa have worked together for, I'm going to say 10, 15, at least 15, 20 years now to achieve these kinds of insights about how best to farm. It's farmer-to-farmer education.
Last question. Ralph, can you hold that for the staff this afternoon? Thank you. We have it. It's unfair, but we do have more time with Olivier than the rest of the audience. Yes. Yes, you.
So I see that your first two, local markets and agroecology, they might solve the problem with, poor farmers. And would you believe that nutrition would, likewise follow? The solution to nutrition is a follow through to that step, or do you think, given limited resources, do you think it's better to approach one over the other? And also, do you assume, or do you see unforeseen consequences, such as like if you would solve the solution to the poor farmers, do you think the percentage of hungry from let's see, like the urban poor would increase likewise, and is that even a possible solution you can control? Would local markets, would poor be able to access that? Is that a
Okay, well, so first, I believe that localized food systems are not, going to completely supersede what has been developing. My message is one of reshifting the focus, right? Having local food markets emerge to supplement the dominant food systems that are not being shaped in that direction. In other terms, we will never be able to get, to do without trade in certain food commodities. And the reason for this is very simple. Not every region can produce the full range of the foods that we need. The point is we've overemphasized the need for agricultural systems to meet the demands of international markets and large markets, and we've underemphasized the need to link local producers to local consumers. But it's a question of rebalancing these different systems, which are now treated in a very imbalanced, unfair way by the decision makers. And these systems have different functions to fulfill, right? We don't produce coffee in Belgium. Well, we'll continue to have to import coffee, and that's a good thing for the coffee producers in the south. The thing is, they should not produce only coffee. They should not be excessively dependent on that. And we should not depend exclusively for our food security on imports. And we should allow our farmers to have access to local markets instead of being obliged to sell only from the international markets. Okay, so the nutrition question, it's a tricky one, because on the one hand, a wide range of foods can result from many global chains developing, right? And in fact, the more you have imports coming in, the wider the diversity of foods in principle should be. What we've seen, that's also part of the nutrition transition, but it's a bit complicated, so I didn't discuss this, but is that those with the highest incomes in these emerging economies, take Mexico or Brazil or increasingly China or India, those who have high incomes, for them, global food chains mean that they choose more diverse diets, good foods, even healthy foods increasingly. But the lowest incomes, the poor segments of the population, they buy the soft drinks and the chips and the breakfast cereals, very rich in salts, sugars, saturated fats, and so forth, energy-rich foods that are affordable. And that are affordable in part because of the very strange way that subsidies function to reward unhealthy diets, right, in many countries. So I think the impacts of globalized food chains differ very significantly depending on the income group we speak of, right? And so I'm not in favor, I don't think it's realistic to say we must, completely abandon these global food chains. I do think we have to fundamentally shift the emphasis from one to the other. As to your second question, I think there may be a misunderstanding, or rather I should clarify that in my view, agroecology can be highly productive, right, in terms of volumes produced. In fact, that was on my written thing. The studies we have recently show how extremely productive, well-managed agroecological systems can be. But well-managed doesn't mean that we just revert to subsistence agriculture as practiced by the grandparents. It means that we teach farmers, ideally by farmer-to-farmer methods, horizontally, right, like the campesino movement in Latin America, which Brother Dave is very familiar with, that we teach farmers how to make the best use of different elements of nature that they have at their disposal. That can be highly productive, and it's certainly less costly for the farmers. So if we look at the political economy of the farming family, we see both that the yields are higher, but also that the costs of producing food are lower. For them, it's a benefit.
Thank you very much. The food is outside. I want to, those of you who are here, obviously because of your interest in nutrition, hunger, the right to food, on October 24th, Food Day, Keith West, head of our Division of Human Nutrition and International Health. We hope when Gilbert gets back, but maybe we can get Cortland to sign up now for the Center for Refugee and Disaster Response, the Anna Bacher Society, and the J.B. Grant Society are all going to work with the CLF for a day-long teach-in. And more news about that, but we're going to continue. We're going to pick up on the wonderful things that Olivier De Schutter has challenged us with today. And I can't thank you enough for your being with us.